Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our discussion on usability evaluation methods. And as you can kind of guess, these methods are around how do you assess usability and how do you measure it in a quantified way, so to speak. And we'll be talking about two broad categories of methods. The first of which deals with user-based methods. And as the name implies, users are being involved in this sort of experience. The first one we'll talk about is card sorting. In card sorting, you ask your users to organize things into some sort of a structure, be it a taxonomy or a navigational structure. And you have kind of two choices to start with. One is a closed set where you have a group of things that are predefined that are essentially treated as a whole, versus an open card sort where things are essentially, everything can be organized. So the user is actually sorting at essentially an atomic level, so a particular item. And you may, in both of these cases, use either physical cards or you may use card sorting software. Once you've gathered that information about how they have organized stuff, you start then using statistical analysis to figure out what is of those choices the better one to go with. Eye tracking software is very cool stuff, right? But it's not commonly used, primarily because there's a hardware component, generally speaking, so that whenever a user is looking at the screen, you need some way of knowing where they're looking. So you essentially are capturing what they look at, how long they look at it, how do they go from one thing to another? So that's your paths, right, of gaze path plots, of they look at stuff and then they move their eyes to something else. How do those things flow? And also focus maps of where are they focusing in general, kind of their vision, and the heat map of what are the places where people are looking at the most. Again, not as commonly used as these other methods, primarily because you need that hardware. You need some way of both bringing the users into an environment. That's another piece, because that's a physical thing you have to do. They can't do this remotely. They're going to come to a lab, put on some sort of hardware, and then interact with something to record what they look at. And you can kind of infer from that, it might be a relatively expensive way of doing things. Surveys are a common way of gathering information from users, not just in user evaluation of designs and interfaces, but in general, right? That's something we do with instruments in general, to do some sort of analysis of data, especially to give users a set of either online queries or potentially paper even, or you might even ask the user in an interview sort of way. When we're talking about it from a UX evaluation perspective, they can be used to capture things like, after a user has done a set of activities, get an opinion from them. What did they think of it? What are the things that stood out as being easy or maybe didn't stand out, which means they may be easy and understandable? What things did the user spend some time trying to figure out? You might also ask them to assess the entire experience and give a sense of how well the whole thing was, not just some particular sets of activities. And there are some standardized questionnaires, instruments that are proven that you might use if you were doing this sort of interaction. And then there's just traditional analytics, where you capture information as the user is using the system. You'll sometimes can capture things like where they're going based upon their activity, how long it takes them to click on a certain button, what is the time between pages that they go between, how long do they stay on a page, and you're kind of approximating to some extent with this eye tracking behavior, but you're doing so at more of a trackable thing of where they went and what they did. And you could even get down to the point of potentially having something that captures what the mouse they're using, if they're using a mouse, where it hovers, and so on, is essentially a proxy for some sort of eye tracking approach. These sort of activities can help with improving metrics that are very impactful to an organization, such as conversion rate, which is going from potentially a lead or somebody just browsing around to an actual customer, or their attitude towards the system, if how long they spend in certain places, and so on. And then a very common way of doing testing involving users is A/B testing. And you see this a lot primarily because of the things we've talked about. Next to analytics, it's potentially one of the less intrusive and expensive ways of capturing information. In fact, it's fairly common for a UI team to develop some new interface and run it and compare it against the old interface. So you have an A, which in that case would be potentially the older interface, and B, the newer interface. Whenever a user comes into either a website or whatever it might be, they will be assigned for that interaction one of those options, and then everything from that point on is going to be captured based upon their interaction with that option. It allows you to gather a great deal of information. That the amount of information will be based upon the traffic of whatever it is, if it's a website, or how much user activity is involved with an application. And it's much more challenging with an application unless you're doing some sort of auto updating and so on. You might actually see some of that whenever you see organizations releasing a beta of their application or pre-release, whatever terminology they might use. That might actually be the B implementation, whereas the traditional application is the A. But there are some challenges with rolling it out other than if you're dealing with websites, but it can be done. For a website, some sort of web interactivity or something like a voice interactivity where there's a clear kind of interface, if you will, of that you can change things out, it's a great approach of gathering a lot of information and analyzing it to determine which one leads to the better results. And those are the user-based methods, which basically means that a user has been in the mix, right? We had a person physically involved in our collection of data. An alternative to that are these no-user methods, which are sometimes called discount methods. And these are discount because they don't cost as much, as simply put. So one of the first ones is a heuristic evaluation. And in heuristic evaluation, we've talked about heuristics before. They're an approximation of a optimal solution. They may or may not result in that optimal solution, but they'll sometimes result in a pretty good solution. So in this scenario, you're taking someone or a group of people and assessing based upon a collection of broad principles, if you will, how well a particular interface is doing to the ideal. And then, and again, there are many of those. And then once you've done that, you can then assess and make choices going forward. You have a choice between a single evaluator where one person literally is going through and looking at the entire interface for the whole implementation, or you may have multiple examiners spending less time examining the interface. And in that scenario, you potentially got concurrency going on in your favor. So it's essentially a way of parallelizing the operation that you're performing. So you're going to get it done more quickly. The only reason I can think of that you might use the single evaluator is perhaps you only have one evaluator. That's one choice. The second choice would be that you need the approval of that evaluator. There's someone that might be renowned in the field, and being able to market that and do a press release saying that that particular individual has reviewed and assessed your application is a good thing. So those are kind of your two different choices of using heuristic-based evaluation. Related and similar to that is a guideline review. You have a particular set of guidelines, and you let the evaluators check for inconsistency using those guidelines. So it's a little different from the previous example in that it's about how specific your guidelines are. So you're going to be more specific most likely with your guidelines. So very, very much of, does this form have this characteristic, whatever that might be. And then keystroke level modeling, so KLM. And this is based upon some of the keystroke modeling going back in 1983, so certainly not a new idea. And it draws upon the idea of cognitive psychology and empirical studies. And the basic idea is being able to keep track of how long a particular user takes to complete tasks and keeping track of things like pointing, clicking, typing, and thinking, so that you're able to assess how long they're taking to do various things. And so you can do some pretty good estimations. It can be error-free task time to within 10 to 30% of the actual time. So not a bad margin of error, so to speak. So it's definitely a way of assessing how long somebody that knows how to do a particular thing takes them to do it. So that's going to speak to how easy it is for them to identify the things they're to interact with and so on. And next we talk about cognitive walkthrough. And it's basically, it's a usability inspection method similar to a heuristic evaluation, but this is more about using it for task scenarios. So you're trying to go through and perform a particular activity. And it's on both learnability from the first time or from occasional users. And it allows you to essentially evaluate how well the user can achieve their goals, and how they would like to accomplish them using your particular interface. An expert goes through each step, identifying the problems the users might face as they're learning about the interface. And at each step, will the user know what to do? If they do the right thing, how do you know? So what sort of feedback do you give them? So it's identifying the activities involved to reach your goal as a user, and then how do you know that you've met it? So is there a feedback loop of some sort? And then we have the practical usability rating by experts, pure. So the idea is that it's an extension of a cognitive walkthrough with multiple evaluators. Ideally, they're HCI experts, so they know a lot about the principles and how something should be done, and also the domain in which they're being asked to evaluate. They essentially decompose the user's task, rate the difficulty on a 3-point scale, and it's basically a way of coming up with essentially a number at the end of the experience, as well as drill down numbers on each of the tasks. And the output can be very executive friendly because you've got 3 levels to talk about on particular sets of activities and tasks. And with that, we move on to a discussion of traditional user evaluation methods. And so this involves typically whenever you're dealing with a user, you may have a participant is another word, a facilitator as well. And the facilitator assigns tasks to the participant. The participant then does those tasks. And while they're doing them, the facilitator is likely observing the behavior, listening for feedback, and the participant may ask some additional questions along the way. And all that information is being captured for analysis. Similarly, you have assessment. So the types of assessment we have are the broad sort of analysis of analytics, right? You have qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative, you're collecting insights, findings, and anecdotes. So people are telling you stories about their experiences and related to the product, not just in general. And they're best for, as most qualitative research is, best for discovering problems in the user experience, and they're more common than quantitative usability testing. And quantitative testing is about gathering metrics that describe the user experience, task success, and time on task. So how often were they able to complete the task with a successful outcome, and how long did it take them to do it? And then the quantitative usability testing is good for collecting data for benchmarks, such as tracking improvements, impact of design changes, comparison with competitors, and demonstrate the value of the design. And they may be used in return on investment calculations. Drilling into qualitative, best for discovering new problems, as is true of most qualitative studies. It's the most common form, and it collects insights, findings, and anecdotes. There's also feedback that's involved from the users. And then quantitative, you've got metrics, benchmarking, very much numbers, just as with quantitative analysis in general. Tasks, facilitator, and location are the things that go into traditional assessment. So the basic idea is location, where do you do it? Sometimes it's in person, so they may actually go to a usability lab. And there's also potentially remote, so that it's moderated. Think Zoom meeting, right? It's similar to an in-person study, except the facilitator and participant are in different locations. The facilitator is still assigning tasks to the user or the participant, and the participant is performing them, and it may be done through some sort of screen sharing software such as Zoom, Teams, whatever. There's also a variation of that, which is remote, and there's not really a facilitator. The tool itself will assign the task to the participant. The participant completes those tasks when they have time. The tool is assessing it as they're doing it, and the researcher is going to receive a recording of the session along with metrics and so on. So a way of doing so in a remote fashion. And with that, again, location, in-person or remote. And with that, we've reached the end of a discussion of usability evaluation methods. Thank you for listening. As always, if you have any questions, do let me know.